Welcome to the NC Choices webinar series, Teaching Tools for Beginning Farmers, funded by the United States Department of Agriculture's Beginning Farmer and Rancher Development Program. I'm Matt Poore, and I'm going to be presenting the module on beef cattle production management. This is one of 7 modules offered in this webinar series. In this presentation, we'll talk about forages for beef cattle. If you're interested in other resources offered by NC Choices, you can find out more on our website or on our YouTube channel. So this presentation is on forage systems for beef cattle. Forage is incredibly important for beef production because it is the foundation for nutrition for all beef cows, regardless of whether they are in pasture or range-based systems. Beef cattle actually are secondary in the production in that the primary product is forages. And beef cattle are grazed on forages as a way to monetize that product that has little value of any other kind. Sound forage management will lead to better beef cattle performance and also improved profitability. So it is very important that beginning farmers study this area. Now, in the Mid-Atlantic and the southeastern states, our forage systems can be grouped into 2 major categories. The first being tall fescue-based systems that predominate the Piedmont and the mountain regions, and then Bermuda grass-based systems that predominate in the coastal plain. Both of these systems have advantages and disadvantages that we'll discuss, but they are, for various reasons, the predominant base forage in each of these types of systems. Now, Bermuda grass is more adapted to sandy type soils, and so that's why it's found in the coastal plain. And the tall fescue is better adapted to heavier clay type soils, and that's why it's found where it is. Forage nutritional value can vary greatly of both of these forages, and so we need to think about that, and we need to match our forage quality with the cattle nutrient requirements to lead to optimal production, and we'll talk about that during this presentation. Now, forage systems are quite interesting because we do have that base forage, but we also need some additional complementary forages to make the thing work optimally. So our successful forage programs will feature the predominant perennial species and then perhaps some annual forages that fit in there. Annual forages can help us fill production gaps and can improve nutrients delivered to livestock in a very targeted kind of way. And we also need both cool and warm season forage species to create a balanced system. This slide shows the forage production pattern for both cool season and warm season forages. The cool season are in blue, and you see that they typically have 2 peaks in production, the first occurring during the late spring in April and on into May, and the second peak occurring in the autumn in the month of October and November. In contrast, shown in purple here is a warm season forage, and examples of that is, again, we talked about Bermuda, but there are others listed here that fit the warm season category, and these forages have their peak production in the summer months. Now, they are very important to the system because they are much more efficient in their use of water, so limited rainfall is oftentimes one of the things that limits forage production. And the warm season forages are more efficient at using this rainfall to create dry matter production. Having both warm season and cool season in the system then, as you can see, helps us to provide good quality growing forage for as much of the year as possible, and that would not be possible with either just all cool season or all warm season forages. Forage systems do require a lot of management, and again, our encouragement for you to consider yourself a forage farmer before you become a beef farmer. Pasture management is essential for efficient beef production, so we need to be thinking about things like the fertility and managing the fertility of the soil, the weed control and how we understand and decide on how to control weeds, the diversity of our systems. Again, too much of a single forage is not good because of the pattern of production, so we want some plant diversity. And then also we want to maintain plant vigor, and we'll talk about how you do that as the presentation goes along. As we talk about grazing management, that becomes a key, because it's important for us to understand that livestock do not understand grazing management. They simply go and choose the most palatable forage they can find, and oftentimes that causes problems with overgrazing in some spots and undergrazing in others. So we must control the animals and get them to graze what we want them to graze. So the principles of grazing management include understanding the animal requirements, understanding the concept of stocking rate, stocking density, and grazing period, as well as understanding residual forage requirements, the rest period that we need on certain forages, the length of rotation, or how many times, how long it takes us to get around to the pasture again. And then we need to be doing observations and monitoring and adapting our management to what we see. One key to maintaining vigorous pastures is to understand that you have to have green leaves over the surface of the pasture. The more green leaves you have, the more of the sunlight is intercepted, and the more solar energy is converted into chemical energy, resulting in growth of the plant. So if there is no green leaf out there, you don't have a solar collector. And so this quote from Jim Garish, a very well-known pasture consultant, when you buy an acre of land, you buy 43,560 square feet of solar panel. It's very true. Now, in addition to that, we also need to be aware that we also have that same square footage of a rainfall collector. And we need to be managing such that we both collect the solar energy and that we also absorb rainfall when it comes, and so that it's released and stored in the land through the normal water cycle. Again, having residue on the surface and maintaining green leaves will benefit both of these parts of the system. This slide shows us the growth pattern for a typical forage crop, and we consider this in 3 phases. In phase 1, this could be after planting or perhaps after grazing. There's very little green leaf tissue. Most of the storage of carbohydrates has been removed from the plant, and so it grows very, very slowly. So throughout phase 1, it's a very slow growth phase, but you see at the end of phase 1, it starts to increase as we start to accumulate enough green leaves to really drive a lot of photosynthesis. Then in phase 2, there are a lot of green leaves. They're young and actively growing, and we have very rapid accumulation of forage dry matter. In stage 3 or phase 3, we start to get shading of the leaves by other leaves. They start to pile up on each other, and the whole system starts to slow down. So the actual growth rate of those forages will slow down because they're so mature, and we need to do something to get them back into a fast growth phase. So the trick to grazing management is that we want to start grazing a pasture when it's in the end of phase 2, just as it's starting to slow down, and we want to graze it down to the point where it's not quite back into phase 1. So we'd like to keep the plant cycling from the end of phase 2 to the beginning of phase 2 at all times. And if we do that, we'll be able to come back around, given good growth conditions, after several weeks to a pasture, and it will be back here in high phase 2 again. Now, the only time we would really want the grass or the forage to go into stage 3 is for a system we call stockpiling. Stockpiling is where we accumulate forage for longer than we know we probably really should from a nutritive value standpoint, but we do that to provide grazing at a later date when we will need it. And so the best example of this is fescue. Tall fescue stockpiles very, very well in the autumn, and because the weather is turning cooler, it does not die and lose its quality like it would during the warm part of the year, and it provides an excellent grazing during the winter months, especially January, February. Another key factor that we need to be aware of is that we do need to be thinking about the roots under the surface. We can't see them, but we do understand quite well how they work and what their physiology is. So root development is strongly related to the frequency and the extent of leaf removal from the forages. So when we graze very frequently or when we graze very short, the roots die. They undergo a process called root pruning, and they're not needed to support the above ground growth, and so they die off. And you can see in this graphic a plant on the left that is cut every week to 2 inches. And you can see it has very short roots, and oftentimes the observation is made that the roots underneath the soil are about as long as the forage above the soil. On the far right, you see a plant that was cut to 2 inches every 4 weeks. So rather than 7 days of rest, it received 28 days of rest. And you can see much more vigorous root system and much more vigorous top growth. And managing, as you see there on the right, is much, much better than managing in the situation you see on the left, which results to low growth, as well as we don't capture the water and the sunshine the way we do with the one on the right. Okay, more on grazing terminology. I want to talk about the stocking rate. These are terms that are thrown around, and you need to understand them as you talk to people about your system. Stocking rate is the number of animal units or live weight present on the grazing unit or farm for the entire season or year. And so this would be the number of cows. For example, if you have a farm with 100 cows year in, year out, that's kind of what you have there. Then the stocking rate is 100 cows. If you have 200 acres, it would be 1 cow per 2 acres. So again, another example, 100 acres grazed by 50 cows weighing 1,200 pounds is 2 acres per cow, or 600 pounds of cow weight per acre, and that's sometimes shown in those different ways. Now, for stock density, which is another important concept, we need to be aware that this is very different than stocking rate, and sometimes those are confused as we talk to especially beginning farmers. So stocking density is the number of animal units or live weight present within a pasture of known area for a specified time. So this is essentially the instantaneous number of cows per acre or per area of land. So for example, here's 2 different stock densities, 50 1,200-pound cows on 1 acre, on a 1 acre pasture. So that's 50 cows per acre, or 60,000 pounds of live weight per acre. That would be the stocking density. If the same cows were on 1/10 of an acre, then the stock density would be 10 times that. So it would be 500 cows per acre, or 600,000 pounds of live weight per acre. Now, the reason that this is important is that as we increase stock density, we get improved forage utilization, we get improved nutrient distribution from the feces and several other major benefits that we get. So it's important for us to try to keep stock density somewhere around 50,000 pounds or higher. Mob grazing, which you may have heard about, it really usually is discussed as more than 100,000 pounds of live weight per acre, but there's no magic cutoff for that. We do know that the bigger the stocking density, the better you do get those factors I mentioned earlier, like nutrient distribution from feces and urine, as well as uniform utilization of the forage. So just to give you a visual example, because this is a very important concept, this is a 100-acre farm with 40 cows, so a little different example, but in this case, we have 1,200-pound cows. The total live weight is 48,000 pounds, and there are 2.5 acres per cow, or 0.4 cows per acre. So that's the way that those are expressed. Now, the stocking rate in this example, there's only one perimeter fence. They're all on one pasture. The stocking rate is 480 pounds per acre. Again, the total number of acres divided by, or the total number of pounds divided by the 100 acres. And the stock density is the same because there's only one pasture. So when you keep them in there and you've got that 480 pounds per acre of stock density, that it's very difficult to get very good forage utilization from that kind of a management scheme. Now, as we move down in stock density and we start cutting the pastures more and more into pieces and rotating, now we still have 48,000 pounds of live weight. There's 10 cows there weighing 1,200 pounds. But our 12 paddocks, our 4 paddocks here are of equal size, and so the stocking rate's still the same. It's still one farm that has 100 acres, and so that stocking rate is 480 pounds per acre. However, the stock density because we have grouped those cows together on 1/4 of the land, is 4 times higher than that. So that's 1,920 pounds of live weight per acre. Now, I won't give you all the details as we move forward, but you can continue to cut this down. So in this case, we've cut each of those quarters in half. So now we have 8 pastures. And the stock density is 8 times what the stocking rate is. And this can go on. Here's another division where we're actually dividing the farm, if you count that out the way that's done, into 400 paddocks. So that means each of these would go into 10. Now our stocking rate has not changed, 480 pounds, but we're up to 192,000 pounds of live weight per acre for the stock density. And it's this kind of intensive grazing management that you start to get a good impact on the soil, and as you get to be more advanced as a grazier, encourage you to try these heavy density grazing situations. Now the other concept I want to lay on you here that's related to stocking rate and stocking density perhaps is carrying capacity. And this is very different because stocking rate is what you have on the farm, that being good or bad, we don't know. But the carrying capacity is the number of animals that your land can sustainably support. So that will depend on your level of inputs, how much fertilizer you put on, what your species of grasses are, all of those kinds of things. But it's clear to state that if stocking rate exceeds the carrying capacity, in other words, if you have more cows than your land can support, then each additional animal has to be supported by feed inputs that come from off the farm. This oftentimes being hay or grain. But up to the carrying capacity, you don't have to bring these resources on the farm, but every cow above the carrying capacity, all of their feed has to come from outside sources. So it's very important that we don't exceed the stocking rate with our carrying capacity. We don't exceed the carrying capacity with our stocking rate. Annual fluctuations in forage production, of course, occur. Year to year, we don't have the same seasons, and things don't always come out the same. So we may have shortages of feed in a low production year. So we do need to make sure that this stocking rate should be conservative because the carrying capacity will vary by year, and we need to make sure that we are being conservative and not overstocking the land. It's one of the most important concepts for beef production in this region. Now, one of the things that we talked about earlier was fertility. It's very important to maintain fertility in our pastures. And we generally focus on nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, which are the main fertilizer nutrients you would purchase. But we need to be aware that a very high percentage of those nutrients, somewhere around 90%, are re-excreted back on the pasture as feces and urine. And so this picture shows a good distribution of fecal pats, and that also means there's a good distribution of the urine. You can't see that, but we do have data actually to compare the two. And when you see a pattern like this, it means there's also good urine distribution. Urine has a lot of nitrogen in it. So this is great, but if you do not do a good job of rotational grazing and intensive grazing, and you let animals stay in a field for long periods of time, much of this manure will end up around the water sources, around the shade trees, and not really be out where it can do a lot of good. So we do need to be thinking about where the manure is going and how we can replace that back in a place where it can actually grow grass as opposed to just sitting there and becoming a cow pie. So the next thing that we want to talk about is the forage rest period. And this is one of the most critical parts of forage management, because if we continue to graze a forage plant over and over again, in other words, in a continuous grazing system, it will become weaker and weaker and weaker, and what we will end up with is a lot of weeds. So we want to make sure that we avoid that. We also can have other problems with these overgrazed patches and pastures, like a lot of water runoff, nutrient runoff, and other issues. So we do need to be rotational grazing, and the rest period needs to be somewhere between 15 and 60 days, and that's the time that you stay off a pasture before reintroducing animals to it. 15 to 20 days in very rapidly growing situations like we might see in the summer with Bermuda grass when there's adequate water. 20 to 30 days during more moderate growth, or oftentimes with our cool season forages that grow a little bit slower. And then once we get into the winter or very poor growth times, then we can do up to 60 days of rest and that might be beneficial. So there's a lot of variation in this, but the key is that rest is critical, and that it should be no less than 15 days. Hopefully, I prefer 25 to 30 days. So some of the tools that we'll need to do a good job of adaptive grazing management are shown here, and things like temporary electric fence and perhaps some ways of getting that out efficiently. You see the four-wheeler in the bottom right that's rigged and ready to go, put up fence. But we also have things like water that we need to be sure that we have. So this is one of the big limitations to more intensive grazing systems, is that we have to have water for animals. We either have to lane them back to a stationary water source, or we need to have, as is shown in this picture, a movable water tank that we can dump over and move to the next spot when it's needed. And that actually works quite well. It's not as hard as you think, and we've got a lot of producers have done that this year. Finally, the thing that I want to mention about adaptive grazing is a thinking process. And the reason it's called adaptive grazing is that we need to be making decisions. These are very subjective decisions about how much or how often we allocate forage. Then we need to be going, and we need to be critically thinking about how we did. Through this process, you will learn to do a better job of not over-allocating or under-allocating forages. And we'll also learn when we can apply different types of management, how we can take advantages of the behavior of the cows and that sort of thing. It really takes an open mind and a thinking mind to be able to come up with the best system. But that's the way all of agriculture is. The more recipe-based it is, the more likely it is to fail at one time or another. And our pasture-based producers really need to be thinking as they go about doing their thing and allocating and managing their pastures. So temporary electric fence is really critical, and many farmers have a perimeter electric fence that keeps their cows in just fine, but we need to make sure that we do have optimal use of temporary fencing where we have it. And so just to give you an example of how that might work, this shows a pasture. It's a pretty good sized pasture depending on the herd of cows. This is about 20 acres, and so it's very big. If we put 100 cows in there, you're down to that 5 cows per acre stock density, which would be on the low side. So the way we start managing more intensively with our pastures is simply by using a single strand of electric wire. And there's a program around this that you can find more detail about on the CEF's website called The Power of One Wire. There are many benefits to having that wire, but in this case, here's how we would use it to get better utilization of this pasture. First, we would put a post at near the water source, and this is shown by this white dot here. So we put that post, generally a fiberglass glass stiff post. Then we run a reel of wire from the fence over there over to that post, and then on to the perimeter fence like that. The blue dot is the water source, and so as you can see now, we can let the cow into the pasture, and they can graze around that whole area and have access to that water and go anywhere in that side of the pasture. As soon as the pasture is grazed down, or we're ready to move to the other side so that we can rest this side, then it's easy to reel up that short section of wire at the water tank. And cows are very trainable to this. As soon as you go out there and start doing it, they'll come down there and meet you, and then very quickly they'll go on into that other side. We do have a lot of farmers, then we can replace the wire, and they still have access to the water source. So this is a fairly quick and simple process. We do have farmers that don't use temporary fence because they say, well, I'm going to have to be chasing these cows around and I won't be able to get them to move easily, and that's absolutely not true. They're very trainable, and it's a very efficient system. Now, I'll mention, I'm not going to say much more about this, but there are a lot of other benefits of using that temporary wire in these production systems. I encourage every producer to explore it. Having cows that are trained to this single strand wire helps in many ways, including if you need to move the herd around, you can make temporary lanes. You can go and cut out an individual animal, 2 people with one of these wires and between them. And there are just lots of different ways that this training to this power source can be helpful in managing the cows. And as a result, we've doubled our stock density in that pasture, and we've dramatically increased our rest period simply by using one inexpensive temporary wire. Now, there's a lot more to it than that. Obviously, you've got to go through training for the cows and others, so encourage you to look for more detail on the Power of One Wire program, and it will help you to get started with that. So now I'll turn to harvested forage management. It's important for us to have some harvested forages in most farms because we will have times of snow or drought or something when we will have to feed the animals from stored feed. So small farms usually will stick to hay and will purchase their hay needs. Others will be making hay. Now, hay is defined as grass or other forage that's been dried, that's been cut and dried to be used as that food for animals. Typically, it doesn't contain more than about 15% moisture, so 85% dry matter. Another option that we're seeing more and more is called haylage or baleage, and this is basically hay bales that are baled wet at a 35 to 50% moisture level, and then they are wrapped, and the silage ferments, which will preserve it. Now, these are fed and managed just like ground bales, that you can sometimes purchase them, so they might be available to farmers that are purchasing hay, and we are seeing that more and more. The advantage of that is that you don't have to have the conditions to dry that down all the way to dry hay, which takes 3 or 4 days of good dry weather to accomplish, and sometimes that is very hard to come by in this area. The third stored forage type is silage. Silage is a crop that is typically chopped and then put in a silo, typically a bunker or a trench where it is packed, and then it ferments. This is common with crops like corn and sorghum and other annuals, but also is sometimes done with forage hay type crops with grasses and that sort of thing. But typically these are used in larger operations that are feeding that have the equipment to feed and all of that. So usually this is not going to be something for a beginning producer. Some comments about harvested forage and how we might approach it and think about it. Plant maturity at harvest is the major determinant of the nutritive value or quality of that forage. So there's no changes that occur. We sometimes are told, well, if you cut it and make haylage out of it, it'll be better than it was when it was standing in the field, but that's not the case. It is dependent on what the crop was that was standing in the field. Stored forages are very expensive. That is a generality you cannot get away from. They cost over twice as much as having the cow harvest the forage herself. And so they're really only useful for times when we just don't have grazable forage on the farm. Hay equipment ownership is the reason that they are so expensive, and sometimes this is a hidden cost because producers don't always calculate that out. But all of the hay equipment is expensive, and it experiences lots of breakdowns. It's just a very demanding process. So only with a very large acreage does it really make sense for you to get into the hay business, and we're talking about hundreds of acres. So depending on the scale of your farm, you may not want to be making hay. Quality hay can be purchased economically in most regions. You do have to do some planning and find some consistent year-to-year suppliers you can work with, but it is possible for farmers just to decide they're going to buy their hay. We need to use forage analysis to find good suppliers and also to make sure that we have hay of adequate quality if we're making our own hay. So there is a program here in the state where we can go and send samples in for analysis and get back that information so that we know how to feed those forages. We also need to think about extending the grazing season with stockpiling or with the use of annual forages, because that will help us to reduce our hay use. There's a good goal that is the name of a lot of programs around the country is 300 days grazing. And many producers have found that target, where they would graze for 300 days and feed hay for 65 days, is a pretty good and practical way to go about things. We will also have other farmers, though, that will have the goal of 365 days of grazing, and that is possible with management, but it does take quite a bit of good management to get that done. Additionally, we also need to think about keeping an emergency hay supply on hand. When we have a severe drought, which is possible really anywhere in the country, but we do experience them here in the southeast, we do need to have a supply of hay so that we have kind of a backup plan there for those short dry spells. And it's wise to maintain about a 30 to 60 day supply, more than what you will need for your winter feeding of hay on hand. So we need to extend the grazing season. I said that to reduce our hay use, but how do we do that? All forages can be stockpiled. There's nothing that says that any kind of a forage can't be kept back in that phase 3 where it just accumulates and there's a lot of material there waiting to be grazed. And it can provide excellent nutrition depending on the forage type. This is also good for your forage system because it's a very rested plant. As you see in this picture, the area that's being grazed ahead of that polywire has been resting for a long time, and that gives a lot of opportunity for biological activity to occur in the soil. It feeds the soil food web and keeps things going. Also, this grazing in this way with the animals all lined up on a strip like that gives very good nutrient distribution, very good fecal distribution, and we keep a lot of ground cover. And also there's very little equipment required for this. So for example, when you're grazing stockpile in the wintertime, basically what you need is your feet, and to go out you might want a reel or some posts that you can use, but a lot of times we'll just move the wire that's in front of the cows and don't actually have to put up and take down anything. This really helps to reduce our equipment needs and the problems we have with tractors in cold weather and that sort of thing. Now, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about fescue toxicosis because, as I said, about 2/3 of the state are dominated by tall fescue, and it does cause problems. And as I said, there are advantages and disadvantages to both Bermuda grass and fescue, but it's especially a problem with fescue. Fescue does have toxins that are in the plant that are the result of a endophyte or a fungus that actually resides in the plant itself. It's an endophyte, meaning it's in the plant. And this fungus lives off the plant. It's very happy living in there. And it makes these toxins that actually help the plant to fend off herbivores like cattle. So it's good for the plant because the cattle don't want to eat it. And it's good for the fungus because it's got a nice place to live inside of this plant tissue. So we need to, if in this you see some pictures here, a couple of pictures, animals that tend to want to stay all day standing in water, or animals that are very rough and have a lot of mud on them from being, again, laid up in that mud hole. This is very common sights on our farms here, especially in the spring of the year. So these are, all of these symptoms we call fescue toxicosis. It's really a circulation problem. The ergot alkaloids cause vasoconstriction, and we have problems with them actually getting good blood circulation to the extremities of their body. Now, if we look at these costs of fescue toxicosis can be subtle because we do see things that we just don't pick up on. Maybe decreased conception rates by a few percentage points, lower milk production leads to smaller calves, lighter weaning weights, in other words. There are also some data now that shows that it can impair semen quality in bulls. It can reduce the gains of cattle after they're weaned and on to a growing system. And we also expect higher treatment costs because we have more problems with foot rot and pink eye and all kinds of other health problems that go along with both physical things like standing in that mud all the time is not good for their feet, but we also have some immune system problems that can occur with this malady as well. All of these factors are estimated to cost the beef industry about $1 billion a year right now, and so it's not a small problem, and there are there's a lot of work going on to be able to deal with that. But if you see these two heifers here, they're typical. On the top heifer was grazing on novel endophyte tall fescue during a study here in North Carolina. The bottom heifer, same day, same study on the toxic, and you can see she's got some mud on her. She's not as thrifty looking, she's thinner, and has a long, rough hair coat, and so that's typical of what we see in these systems. Again, here's a typical situation. Midsummer, animals under a shade, they want to stay under there all day and create a mud hole, and you can see the amount of mud that's packed up on these poor steers at this point in time. So if this is such a problem, what do we do about it? And I'll just give you an introduction to that. We need to understand the status of our pastures. So this little flow diagram here says test at the top. That means we want to test and see how infected, how many of the plants are infected with the fungus and how many may be not infected. If we have a very low infection rate, we can just keep those pastures and know that we don't really have a problem related to the fescue. If we have a high infection rate, which is much more common, most of our farms will have high infection rates, then we can impose a management strategy to try to manage around the problem, or we can replace that fescue with something that's not going to be toxic. The management things that we can try, we can put in summer warm season species, and I said that earlier, but fescue is a cool season, so we can put some warm season in to complement that. We can dilute the fescue with other species of grass and forage crops. We can do some supplemental feeding of the animals, and we have to be careful with our fertilization and other practices that we have. But we can be successful with toxic tall fescue. It's just a challenge to us. Now, one of the benefits that's been really pushed out there for helping with fescue toxicosis is the use of clovers. And this is some data from an experiment in Georgia where they compared toxic fescue pasture to toxic fescue with red and white clover interseeded. Average daily gain went from about 1.2 pounds per day to about 1.8, pretty substantial increase, and weaning weights were increased by about 75 pounds. Conception rate went from about 70% to 92%. And again, I gave the goal of 90 being a good goal, and obviously 71 is quite low. So clover can help it actually helps any system by bringing nitrogen in, improving the forage nutritive value, and resulting in higher performance of the cattle. So that's something that's strongly recommended. But we also can have forage dilution for other species that will help with fescue toxicosis. Any of the clovers, any of the other legumes like Lespedeza or alfalfa, summer forages like crabgrass, other cool seasons like orchard grass, all of those can benefit us by diluting out the fescue toxins. So again, having a very diverse forage system is probably most beneficial. We also can use some of the more expensive forages, the pearl millet, sorghum Sudan, and then perhaps warm season perennial pastures as well to rotate cows in and get them off of fescue during the summertime, and that will help with the problem quite a bit. Now, I want you to understand the endophyte definitions better, and on your left you will see toxic endophyte. This is the way that the fungus lives in the plant, the blue being the plant cells, the red is the mycelium of the fungus. It lives right in there, as I said, and produces those toxins. Now, there are endophyte-free fescue varieties out on the market, and if you look at those, there are no visual fungus in the plant. It's simply free of the fungus. Now, that was promoted heavily 20 years ago. The problem is that the fungus becomes very important to the durability of the plant. That fungus really gives it a lot of the characteristics that we like in tall fescue. And so most people were unsuccessful at growing endophyte-free fescue. So the third option is there on your right, and this has green squiggles through it, those being the mycelia of what we call a novel endophyte. And these novel endophytes are not toxic. They give the benefits to the plant that we've come to expect with tall fescue, but they don't produce the toxins that hurt the cows. And so these are really great new varieties. There's about 7 varieties of this type of forage on the market, and we strongly encourage farmers to, if they're planting new pastures, to use a novel endophyte, and if they have very toxic fescue pastures, that they go through the process of killing those and starting some non-toxic or novel endophyte on their farm. Really, this approach is a breakthrough, and we need all farmers to start considering transforming their forage system with novel endophyte fescue. One caution about that, there's no free lunch, as they say, And one thing to keep in mind is that the novel endophyte fescue, it produces about the same amount of forage as the toxic fescue, but animals like it and they will eat more. And so that will probably reduce your carrying capacity some to go to that novel endophyte fescue, but it will produce much, much better growth in cattle. Now, if you are entering the local meat business, local beef cattle production, local beef production, you need to be very observant about this fescue toxicosis issue. It's extremely difficult to finish animals on toxic fescue, Kentucky 31, the old variety. We strongly recommend the use of novel endophytes in people developing a system for local beef production. So the next topic that I want to talk about is weeds. And this is always something that we get a lot of discussion about. Of course, we have herbicides as a tool to manage weeds, but that's really not a substitute for good grazing and forage management. It's important to recognize that the common weeds that we have are oftentimes the result of overgrazing and poor forage management. We need to understand the weeds, what they are, which ones are toxic, and why they tend to dominate in some systems. So there are many definitions of weeds that you can find, and in general, a weed is a plant that is not wanted where it is. And so the best definition, or the best way to sum it up, I think, is a plant in the wrong place. And in many cases, as I mentioned, we're trying to shoot for diversity of plants in our pastures. And so this means that we may have a lot of different plants that would not be the main species that was planted in that pasture, but that nevertheless can provide a positive part of the pasture that we have. So just because a plant is there that was not planted does not mean that it's undesirable or that it's in the wrong place. And so we've got to think about that as we approach weeds and make sure that we don't sort of expect that we have nothing but a single species of plant, that which we planted. That usually does not occur, especially in older pastures. Now, there's a number of different plants that are listed in this graphic. They're hard to see along the bottom, but on the left here are desirable forage plants. These are things like fescue, clover, Bermuda grass, gamma grass, switchgrass. All of those are desired species for the most part. And the tall bars are the energy content, the gray bars there, and the orange bars are the protein content. And so you can see where those typically run. Now, everything from the middle to the right are what are considered weeds in many cases. But as you can see, they have a very high energy content in general, nearly as high or even higher than the desirable forage plants. And they also have as high or higher of a protein level as the desirable forage plants. So again, just because we typically call it a weed doesn't mean that it might not be good feed for the cow. Now, we can talk about plants that are indicators of problems, and this is sometimes how we use weed populations to try to better understand what we have. And so I'll let you read this list. But if we think about the cultivated soils primarily, then we're talking about things like lamb's quarters, plantains, chickweed, buttercup, very, very common pasture weeds. And most of them come from situations like compaction and other issues with cultivation. And so we can, again, we would advise you to get an advisor to come out to the farm, look at your pastures, and talk about what kind of weed problems you actually do have, because oftentimes it's maybe not so bad that you need to use an herbicide, but maybe you just need fertility or something like that. Now, the truth is cows can be trained to eat weeds, and this is something that we've talked a lot about. You want to make sure that the weeds are not terribly poisonous, that you're teaching them to eat, but there are techniques that you can find on the web for teaching animals to eat weeds that might dominate on your environment. But this particular picture is simply cows that have been grouped up and grazed in a high stock density, as we talked about earlier, and in a pasture. This is the same scene. So you can see some little stems here that resulted after grazing that resulted from these horse nettles, which is a very prickly sort of a spiny type of a plant that we see sometimes, and is definitely is a weed. It's a compaction indicator, but it's common in pastures here. But you can see that with good grazing management, these animals actually ate those weeds, and we have tested that plant, horse nettle, and typically in this, actually I did test this exact plant at this time, and it was 16% protein, and the energy level was very high. So while animals would not perform well if they had nothing but that to eat, because it does have stickers and prickly stuff on it, having it as part of their diet is probably beneficial. And so we need to be a little less critical of our weeds and make sure that we don't remove weeds that are actually contributing to the system. Now some points to consider about weed management. We need to plan and be observant and get some advice from somebody that really knows how to walk pastures and tell you what kind of a weed problem you have and how to manage it. We need to do a better job of grazing management because we can sustain our forage resource through that. We can have a very thick and vigorous pasture that will keep most of the weeds out that we don't want. We need to reevaluate our stocking rates and our carrying capacity, make sure that we're not trying to carry more cows than our land is suited for. We need to have long rest and recovery periods for the grass so that desirable forage can dominate and cover most of the weeds. And then the higher density grazing we can do, the better we will control weeds. We also need to think about forage species diversity and realize that as pastures evolve over time, they will take on a multi-species diverse characteristic. It's not that they're weedy, they're just changing and evolving. We need to protect and feed the soil because, again, the soil problems oftentimes are the problem with a weed problem. And we can use strategic mowing and herbicide use. Mowing is a very effective way of controlling weeds and keeping them from getting really big and taking over a pasture, but they tend to be back the next year, especially if they are perennial species. And so selective herbicides, when and if they make sense, is recommended. But that's kind of, as you see on this, that's the last thing that you do, is to decide you're going to go with a chemical and try to kill the weeds. The reason for that is that clover is one of our most desirable species in all these pastures because, as I said earlier, it brings in nitrogen, does a lot of good for the system. But almost all herbicides kill clover, and so we got to be very careful that we don't go out and kill our clover, and while we're trying to kill weeds, do more damage to the pasture than we did good. Now there's always development in herbicides. There is an herbicide coming out that will not kill white clover, which is one of our most important species, and so there are some options coming all along the way. But in general, we want to minimize that herbicide use. So in summary, forages provide the foundation for our beef production systems, and we need to really be serious about studying them. Adaptive grazing management will optimize your forage use and your cattle performance, and so it's another thing you need to study very carefully. We need to manage for diversity in our forage system, not depend on one or two species, but have some diverse forages out there. And we need to match the feed supply with the nutrient needs of our specific groups of cattle. We need to extend the grazing season so that we can reduce the use of harvested forages. They are important, but we don't want to feed too much hay. We want to make that as minimum as we possibly can. And then we also need to use strategies to reduce the negative impacts of fescue toxicosis. With all of those things combined, you can have a very strong, very good pasture system that will support your beef cattle enterprise. Well, thank you. Last thing I'll say is that there are many educational opportunities as you learn more and more, and forages and beef cattle management is a lifetime learning situation. You'll never learn it all, and your skills need to be honed and modified as we go along. So learn by doing. Don't let anybody tell you that putting a lot of emphasis on your forages is not a good idea. It is the way to build a productive beef cattle system.